About a third of Singapore's domestic exports will face a new 12.5% US tariff from Friday, in a fresh blow to the country's trade-reliant economy. This comes after the United States concluded that the country does not have sufficient measures to block imports produced wholly or in part with forced labor. The Trade and Industry Ministry says it will continue to engage with the US Trade Office to explore options. More details on how the tariff will be implemented will be shared when ready. MTI says Singapore does not condone forced labor and has a strong record against such practices. Singapore is also among 16 economies under a separate US trade investigation into excess manufacturing capacity. Its findings have yet to be released. An analyst warns the higher tariffs could weaken Singapore's competitiveness and reshape supply chains.
There are some governments that have no tariffs as a result. They were not part of the 60 countries, and they then have a comparative advantage because they have zero tariffs on their products. And so it will be an interesting set of supply chain discussions within companies to think about not just what is your rate, but what is your rate compared to your competitors. And in some cases, you're better off, and in some cases, you are worse off.
The Singapore Business Federation says it will work closely with affected businesses to understand the impact and support them through this period. It also stressed that local firms support efforts to uphold responsible and ethical supply chains. One analyst says the immediate impact on Singapore's economy is likely to be limited, with many of the country's key exports, including pharmaceuticals, exempt from the tariffs. He adds that Singapore's strengths lie in keeping open channels of communication with the US and diversifying partnerships and supply chains.
Whether it's the future of investment and trade partnership that Singapore signed with over a dozen other small and medium-sized countries last year, or the Digital Economic Framework Agreement, which is due to be signed in November of this year at the ASEAN Summit. Singapore's been quite at the forefront of these kind of deals, and it finds that its best bet is to cast its net as wide as possible in order to deal with broader turbulence in the global economic system.
And here to break down the implications of the tariffs for Singapore is Alex Capri, who is a senior lecturer at the NUS School of Business. He's also a former trade specialist at the US Treasury Department. Alex, good to have you here with us.
Pleasure.
The new tariffs came just hours after our Foreign Affairs Minister Vivian Balakrishnan spoke to Secretary of State Marco Rubio and made a case against tariffs. So why wasn't the US convinced?
Well, I think, number one, he wasn't speaking to President Trump, who ultimately makes all the decisions. I think number two is, Singapore was lumped into a bucket with these 59 other countries. This is part of a larger effort in the United States to really look for any kind of legal structure that's going to allow them to keep that tariff wall up, right? So I think it'd be quite easy to prove that Singapore is not a major conduit of forced labor. In fact, if you look at the public record in the United States, the Federal Register actually publishes whenever there's a shipment that's held up where release is withheld. And you can go back 50 years, and there's never been a shipment from Singapore held up for forced labor. Other countries, yes, but not Singapore. So I think this goes back to the bigger strategic issue that the United States is trying to preserve, that sort of that Trumpian protectionist kind of approach.
So is forced labor even the real driver here? Or what is that broader strategic issue or advantage the US is hoping to have here?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely looking to continue to push collecting revenue at the borders. The US government is looking for any form of revenue. They see duties as a way to collect that revenue, even though many of those duties are actually assessed on American firms that are importing their goods from Singapore and elsewhere, right, as part of their value chains. But for the time being, that I think is going to be the approach of the Trump administration. And remember, we've gone through a sequence of laws, right? First, you had the Emergency Powers Act, which the Supreme Court struck down. Then we got into Section 122 with the so-called reciprocal tariffs. And within those 150-day period, right, there was a ticking clock on that, which just expired, and now we have the rollout of the Section 301, right? So this is just a continuum, if you will, right? It's where the administration is looking to continue to push its protectionist policies.
Yeah, so at this point, of course, Singapore has a free trade agreement with the US. And at the point when the tariff was set at 10%, our Ministry of Trade and Industry did not retaliate at that point. And then now that the rate is now 12.5%, what does this say about the trade relationship between both Singapore and the US?
Well, look, I think it's messy, and frankly, from the U.S. side, it's a bit hasty, I think, and it's not really thought through that much, right? So I think, when you look at Singapore, Singapore did not enter into any of these specific arrangements during the reciprocal tariff phase of 122 that other countries did, right? They either negotiated carve-outs, or there were partial exemptions, or they entered into bilateral, very, very specific discussions with the U.S. That didn't happen with Singapore, right? The reason they had the 10%, right, is because they the United States recognized that there was a trade surplus, right? The U.S. was running a trade surplus with Singapore, and therefore, they went with the 10%, right? But now that we've switched to Section 301, Singapore just gets chucked into that wider bucket.
Yeah, and speaking of that 10% as well, we know our neighboring economies, both Malaysia and Indonesia, they will face a lower 10% tariff. So how does that impact Singapore, especially when it comes to decisions made, when it comes to supply chain decisions, investments, even orders in the region? Mm-hmm. Can we see that shift away from Singapore?
Not really. I think if you look at Singapore's value chains and you look at where, really 2/3 of the exports from Singapore are semiconductors, refined petroleum and petrochemicals, right? Aviation, aeronautics, so very, very high value add parts of the value chain. I don't see, a small sort of margin or small spread in a small sector of the overall industry leaving Singapore to go to places like Indonesia or Malaysia for that reason.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier the legal issues. So the original baseline tariffs, we know that was struck down by the US Supreme Court. So do you see this likely to be a short-term bargaining chip by Washington, or can we expect this to be quite a long-term policy here?
I think there's going to be a fair amount of durability, unfortunately, to this Section 301. As we saw, with the transition from Trump 1 to the Biden administration actually kept in place most of Trump 1 Section 301 tariffs on China. There is actually legally there's a lapse after 4 years, basically, where the Section 301 would get revisited. There would have to be a fairly strong push politically to go ahead and not continue them. But when you look at Section 301, it's very, very different from emergency powers, or again, as I mentioned, the Section 122. Section 301 involves an investigation. It involves documentation of that investigation. It involves public hearings and a period for public comments, a finalization period. That is a very, very distinct, very, very different process than either Singapore looking to move under its FTA with the U.S. or looking to challenge. So that's a much more established process. Although there have been arguments made that legal process that took place under Section 301 was very hasty, that the hearings were compressed. I've heard stories of the public, the trade public, calling in to the public hearing, and the hearing lasting a minute or 2 minutes, basically, right? So we'll see if that sort of thing gets challenged. But for now, I think the durability of Section 301 is something that we have to really keep an eye on.
Yeah, now very quickly before we go, Alex, is there any chance that Singapore can convince Washington to remove the tariffs? Is there anything we can do at this point, or has that ship sailed?
Well, I think this is going to be a gradual process of diplomacy, and I think Singapore will do a good job of sort of moving that process along bit by bit, rather. And I think, there already are significant numbers of carve-outs. We could see more carve-outs happening. And at some point, depending on what happens, particularly in the semiconductor industry here, as semiconductors here gain critical mass around high bandwidth memory, which is a really, really critical part of AI, I think as Singapore maybe consolidates its position around there, it'll have a little bit more of a sort of a bargaining chip with the United States. But that is unfortunately the way the world works now with Washington, right? It's bilateral negotiations and it's talk to the boss.
Alex, thank you so much for your analysis. I've been speaking with Alex Capri, who is a senior lecturer at the NUS School of Business and former trade specialist in the US Treasury Department.